Today is October 30th, 2023. What I noticed about the it's very obvious, isn't it? That by definition, it means that the indices represents the overall accumulation of net effect of the individual stocks that comprise of the QQQ. DIA is also the same as the Dow Jones, and SPY is the same thing as the S&P 500. So these stocks that belong to these indices will, in most cases, follow what the QQQ is doing on a cumulative basis. So looking at an individual stock is slightly different than what the overall tendencies are. But the reality is the overall market sentiment is represented by the QQQ. So then the market sentiment is represented by the QQQ or the indice. Market sentiment is represented by the Dow Jones or the DIA. The market sentiment is represented by the SPY, which is the S&P 500. So that means, is it the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog? So if I were to relate Meta with the QQQ, Meta would be the dog's tail, and the QQQ would be the dog. And the QQQ is waving the Meta. Of course, there will be individual news that impacts Meta, but in reality, what is happening is the dog wiggles the tail, not the tail wiggles the dog. So this is something that was so obvious, but it just took a while to understand. Which means if I look at the QQQ here today, at about if I change it to a 1 minute time, if I look at here and I'm looking at this situation here, there was a drop and then pop and then drop. That's a chair. That's essentially a chair formation right there. You see that? There's a plateau, slight up, and then started coming back down. That is a chair setup. I just pointed that out. So if I look at this, set up here at about 7:57. Okay, this is the QQQ. And if I look at the Meta, okay, so if I look at Meta here at about 7, right here, it had this individual reaction by itself. But that, again, right there is a chair setup, right there. That is a chair setup. Okay, that right there is a chair setup. Look at that. Boom. Right there. This is something I should be. So I'm looking at here, right there. Boom. Right there. That's the back of the chair. And then the back of the chair falls. That's how things work. So essentially, this aligns with what the QQQ is doing. It's a composite of the other stocks. And that little bump right there corresponds with the 8 o'clock this morning when the NASDAQ was, or the QQQ was up to this point. So if I revert back, now of course the variance separates here from the QQQ. So if I look here, see that? So overall behavior is represented at the onset, and then here it rebounds, and this is where the Meta and QQQ separates. So some other component was impacting the stock here. So at about 11:30, if I look at Meta at 11:30, approximately at about 11:30 right here, is when the separation occurred between the NASDAQ and Meta right here, because the NASDAQ started to keep going up. Now it's diverged. So the impact of Meta on the QQQ, something else was impacting it, like maybe Amazon. So if I look at Amazon, so if I look at Amazon, yep, look at that right there at about 11:30. This component took over control of. So if I look here, same thing with Apple. And so if I look here, all right, so that had a lesser extent to influencing. So now look at that. Microsoft was a big component that created this movement here. That was Microsoft. And at about 8 o'clock right here is when things changed. So it followed here, and NASDAQ followed this guy. It's represented by volume, right? So if I look at Google, in a similar way, right? So what this means is that trading is essentially knowing the components that interacts with a particular setup. So there are various things that need to be observed in order to optimize or to increase the efficacy of the trade. Essentially, that's what it means. So I have to keep track of if I am in a trade, if I am in a trade with Meta here, okay? If I'm in a trade with Meta and I'm in the heat of it right here, right? So I need to keep an eye on the QQQ or the NASDAQ at this point to see how it corresponds. And when it starts to move away from what's happening, so what I can do is put up these components that are related, that interact with each other to provide some hints. So that's the first level of understanding, which is the indices. What is the indices doing? How is that related to this individual stock? Okay. When there's a correlation, so that would be correlation number one. Confluence number one is looking at the indices, see what the indices are doing. Okay. What is the Dow Jones doing? So I can look at all three of these components to see how they interact. And when they show certain interactions, then I can keep an eye on what they're doing to give credence to the trade that I will be making. Okay. So then once that is achieved, then I can see where the critical points of the indices are, and then also correlate with the critical components of where the stock is. And when I see a certain, so there'll be, the indices will be number one, the critical levels will be number two, and setups will be number three. Okay, see what the level, so those are the three minimum things that I need to have constantly being monitored. So indices, levels, setup. Those are the three things I need to have in my mind when I'm trading. Okay. So like the setup here, right here, like that, right there. That's the setup right there. And how is that related to when I look at here, when I'm trying to enter here? How is that related to the indices? What is the Dow Jones doing? Now Dow Jones will have a lesser impact on the Nasdaq as well as the SPY. And so looking at it from that perspective, how probable is my trade when I enter a trade? Okay. And so that could also impact the stop losses that I have.